Hello and welcome to a Conquest The Last Argument of Kings event report for HeroCon 2025. HeroCon is run every year by the Australian Defence Wargaming Association in Canberra, Australia, raises a ton of money for defence and veteran related charities, and this year, as last year, I played Conquest there. We had 5 rounds over 2 days, and this was the toughest field HeroCon has ever seen, with something like a full fifth of the field being players who have qualified for, been invited to World Championships at HEOS, and that meant 5 absolutely cracking games over 2 days. So in this video, we're going to talk about the list that I took to HeroCon, how and why it was built, some meta considerations, some concessions that the list made, and then we'll go through all 5 games that I played. Now, these will not be detailed turn-by-turn replays. Rather, we'll talk about how each of the lists performed, what were some of the major lines of play and things that decided the game, lessons learned, and just generally what made the game interesting as we chart our way through 5 rounds at HeroCon. Now, on screen now is the 100 Kingdoms list that I played at HeroCon. This list is a Theist feudal list in the 100 Kingdoms, and the Theist feudal alliance is generally pound for pound the most resilient of the alliance combinations that you can make, and while it is reasonably fast over the long game, it does give up the fastest options that 100 Kingdoms have. So it does not have access to things like Sealed Temple or Orders Cavalry generally, and it doesn't have access to either the Vanguard deployment or Imperial supremacy that the Imperial Alliance would give. Instead, what you get is the most layered defensive buffs you can include in a list, with pretty much every unit in this army being able to reroll 6s to save, and having good native defense, and having Indomitable to help shore up some of the resolve issues that you might otherwise run into in 100 Kingdoms. On top of that, the list has a bunch of healing. Let's just talk through it point by point. So, we begin with a mounted noble lord with eccentric fighting style in 3 household knights. Now, this is the part of the list that I would change, but full disclosure, I did put myself under a constraint when building this. The goal of this list was to include as many painted models as I physically could, and that meant putting 3 units of cavalry on the field. Now, household knights are not a bad regiment. They are at their best in Theist feudal. That's where you put the maximum number of buffs on them. And the mounted noble lord is basically a concession to getting as many of those units on the field as I could. He is very expensive. We'll talk at the end of this list section about what I would replace him with under normal circumstances, but he does give me a 3rd feudal character because there are 2 other noble lords in this list. The one good thing about him is that he projects the feudal aura onto the household knights that he's in. He allows the feudal aura, which gives you rerolls of 6 to hit, rerolls of 6 to defense rolls, and that's very significant on basically all of the feudal regiments in this army. And having that aura be in 3 places at once means that there's less chance of your knights bolting out of that aura off into the sunset where they don't get very good bonuses because the bonuses from the feudal aura are very strong on household knights. And so just having the mounted noble lord, as much as he is almost as expensive as an entire unit by himself, does give me that. We then have a chapter mage, School of Water. She's in 3 mercenary crossbows. This is the only non-theist unit in the list, but she's reasonable support. She was painted, so she was included, but there were some meta considerations that had me include her. And while I didn't run into many of those meta considerations, there were at least a couple of situations where she would be very important. And she adds more healing to the list, lets this list really push through damage if it needs to, which is really useful. We've then got the main combat group. So we've got the Noble Lord, who is a warlord. He has the Mask of Euclides and the Elysian Fragment, and he's in a unit of 8 men-at-arms with a seasoned veteran. Now, this is a deviation from how I would often run a unit like this, and I've been very, very happy with it. One of the things that is missing from this list that would often be in my 100 Kingdoms list is a foot noble lord, sometimes a horse noble lord, with the combination of eccentric fighting style and the Caliburn sword. Now, this gives you a real blender character. On foot, you've got 8 attacks on 3s with full rerolls, cleave 1, and your opponent rerolls successful defense rolls, which lets that noble lord really blend his way through units. And basically you put him in however large a regiment of men-at-arms you think needs to exist for him to survive to get multiple clashes. Now, the first version of this list that I tested included that, but I was rejiggering things and changing things around. One of the things that I tested and was very happy with was the Elysian Fragment in that Noble Lord's regiment. And basically the reason there is that, and what I have found, is that that men-at-arms regiment only really needs to push through 1 hard target a game. But if I can push through a hard target cleanly, then that tends to punch through enough enemy hitting power that just weight of numbers and the healing can see me through the rest of any subsequent fights. And because that unit is Theist, and because it puts out so many attacks, and because especially on the Theist Supremacy turn it can be blessed if it really needs to, basically consistently in testing and in 4 games out of 5 here at HeroCon, its ability to just pull the trigger on Elysium Fragment and blow through whatever it was fighting, rather than maybe do a bunch of damage because the Caliburn Lord is very dangerous, but have to go through multiple rounds of fighting, that just burst through power tended to translate into so much valuable momentum, especially given that the Elysian Fragment is cheaper than Caliburn and Eccentric. It is a piece that I will absolutely be using again in any Theist Feudal Alliance that I run. So these guys run in a big block. Men-at-Arms can block up really nicely. They do not have to play wide, which means you can go 3x3 is usually how I would put that list, that unit on the field. And the fact that they can go 3x3, and that you've got another men-at-arms unit in the other Noble Lord's Regiment that can go 3x2 or 2x3, actually lets this army concentrate force reasonably well. It can project quite a lot of force in a small amount of space, and that's very, very valuable. Especially in a list like this that is running virtually no ranged, it's almost all melee. One of the weaknesses of melee armies is that they tend to have to fight along a broad front. Because they can't concentrate force, they're relying on that melee power to avoid suffering defeat in detail. And so the fact that this list, if it needs to, firstly has burst through potential, but secondly, is actually able to compress down into a very narrow frontage is a really big deal. We've then got 3 men-at-arms and then 2 MSUs of Household Knights. Knights are very solid. Knights need the feudal aura. I would overall describe Household Knights kind of as an overcosted regiment unless you layer every single buff, but this list layers every single buff on them. So even though nominally a little mediocre for their 170 points, 170 points is not that expensive, and in this list you are taking a relatively basic chassis and you're giving it the feudal aura and the theist aura and divine purpose, so they are genuinely fast with very long range threats, and the theist supremacy turn, and all of those things collectively do make Household Knights more or less worth 170 points. Also, all of my knights are painted. We then have a third Noble Lord, so a second Noble Lord on foot, one on horse. That Noble Lord is in 5 men-at-arms with a seasoned veteran. This is just a good, solid fighting regiment. It has enough wounds, it's tough enough to push through one fight usually, and I usually only need it to push through one fight because it's not terribly expensive. The entire package is only something like 255 points. It generates the Noble Lord aura. It brings 2 activations to the field. It's got 20 wounds with defense 2, with shields, with hardened 1, with reroll 6s, with indomitable 1, with passable resolve. It's just a good combat regiment, and it fits very well into the list with all of the Theist synergies. And then finally, to make the list a Theist list, we have a Theist Priest, just in 3 Militia Bowmen. Now, something that I have done for a very long time is try to get value out of the Theist Priest's regiment, doing things like putting him in Crusaders and putting him in Sakari, and I would definitely say that that is something that's very good to do, particularly in a Theist Imperial alliance. But in Theist Feudal, there is less incentive to do that, and you actually want more feudal regiments on the field to benefit from the feudal auras. And the only feudal regiments the Theist Priest can go in is Militia Bowmen, who are just cheap and sit in the back, or Militia, as in the melee militia, and those guys, I'm not quite willing to take the risk on that. And that means the Theist Priest is operating in a pure support capability. I am just hoping that every now and again the Militia Bowmen might do a wound to something, and in fact they would have some games where they would massively overperform. They'd also have other games when they do absolutely nothing, but they're 80 points. I don't care. Thumbs up. Finally, we have an Archangel. This is an Archangel with a shield. I have attended an event using the Archangel with the sword. I like it a lot. I ran that in actually a feudal imperial list that just splashed theists in, and it was super fun and very good. But this list has big blocks of infantry. It is built to be durable. It is built to present a wall of shields towards your opponent, give them nothing resembling a flank if at all possible. And so just generally the durability of the Shield Archangel was a big deal because the Sword Archangel is all about very long-range, powerful dive bomb threats. This list does not move that quickly. Secondly, I've just got all of these infantry, so the regeneration aura of the Archangel actually very relevant. Over multiple games of practice, the formation that I kind of developed to roll this list out is to bring the big infantry blocks onto the field and just leave slots in between them where the Archangel could walk onto the field. And basically you want to build that formation where you have 2 large blocks of infantry, the Archangel either in between or just off to the side, where she can support them, give her big divine purpose aura, and get some kills, make some attacks that actually trigger that regeneration. I would trigger some kind of regeneration every single game this event, meaning she was actually able to mint a fair bit of value. Now, let's talk about a couple of things. Firstly, how would I change this list if I wasn't under any painting constraint? And secondly, what were some of the meta considerations that I was thinking about? The easiest thing to talk about there is just how would I change this if there were no painting constraints, and that would be that I would cut that noble lord on horse in a hot second. It is aggressively expensive, and you can just cut it wholesale and add a crusading lord in a unit of 6 men-at-arms with veteran and hardened veteran for the seasoned veteran for the same cost. And that regiment is more dangerous and way more durable. It doesn't project the feudal aura, but it can feasibly fight an entire flank by itself, and there's a lot of support for infantry in this list. So that is a change I would strongly consider making. And if I run this style of list at an event or outside of an event, again, that's something that I will try. Now, meta considerations are always very important when you're trying to go as best as you can in any large event. 5 rounds, 6 rounds. If your goal is to win, you have to know what you need to push through. And there are a few things on my hate list here that I knew I needed to be able to deal with. The first, which I didn't actually necessarily expect, but which I had to at least be prepared for, is Yuguri with 4 spiders or 3 spiders, anything of that sort. That's probably the most powerful meta list at the moment. It's frankly a little bit degenerate. And while I am not actually convinced this list can fight the spiders, it can potentially hold them up for as long as possible. Especially the men-at-arms units are very good at stalling out spider damage because they are hardened 1 and untouchable, which means that deadly blades really struggles to connect. Spiders actually don't do a tremendous amount of damage into these units, and then spiders tend to rely on Terror 2, which will push through these units. They aren't fearless, but they're Indomitable 1, Indomitable 2 on the larger infantry blocks. Now, just being able to hold spiders up, because I'm not convinced I can kill them with this list, the damage output is not quite there. Elysian Fragment has no effect on spiders. Generally speaking, the entire spider blob will all be evasion 3 at the beginning of the first activation of the round, and Yuroni will usually win. But in the event that I fought that list, the idea basically was I would draw as many spiders as possible into a fight with the men-at-arms. I would keep them as healed up as I could, and those spiders, despite the fact that they're very, very powerful, they are arguably very undercosted. They're still expensive units, and because they're expensive units, men-at-arms are not hugely expensive. The idea would be pull them into a central fight or a fight against that center of mass, and use all of the knights to fight every other Euroni regiment. Because even the 4 spider lists still have lots of small, powerful Euroni MSUs that they're relying on to go everywhere else, to do all of the scoring, etc. And those I can potentially fight and beat with things like the Household Knights. Now, is that guaranteed? No, not even remotely. Euroni are very powerful. But I out-threat them, I can do damage, and there's at least a line of play there. The other thing, and there's a meta consideration here, another thing that I was prepared to play against but didn't, was Sorcerer Kings, in particular Sorcerer Kings with water, possibly water air school. A major vulnerability in 100 Kingdoms is School of Water because of the rituals. If you are running light melee, light mainstay regiments, range regiments, so things like the Theist Priest and the Chapter Mage, and you do not have healing, then the offensive water rituals will 2-tap those units without any need to roll a dice, because you are defense 1, and the offensive water ritual inflicts 6 hits AP 1. What that means is that if you do not take healing that is independent of the Archangel, right, if you don't have a water mage yourself, you will be down almost 400 points by turn 5, turn 6, and there is virtually nothing that you can do about it. And so this meant that even if under normal circumstances I would really prefer a fire mage, I rate fire mages very highly, the water mage was just necessary to make sure that I had a Theist priest alive in time to supremacy if I played against Sorcerer Kings. Now, she was fine. The healing in the various infantry units would be totally serviceable. Actually, a bunch of her other spells would have much more of an impact over the course of various games. And that kind of brings us to our third meta consideration, which is Dweghom. Now, Dweghom have always been a rough matchup into 100 Kingdoms. There is just too much stuff in Dweghom that is more durable than you, and shoots the hell out of you, and specifically counters your kind of defenses, things like Pyroclast, which hit you in the flank. And the nature of Dweghom formations has almost always meant that they outforce concentrate you. The way to play against Dweghom is to either try and find a way around them, or generally just cede space against their center mass and try and play scenario everywhere that they aren't. That does not work as well against new Dweghom, because their force projection of any individual aspect in their list, and this is talking about Tempered, which is the most common Dweghom at the moment, The tempered arc node effect lets them project a lot of force onto any part of the battlefield, which means Dweghom can actually fight a little bit dispersed and hold you at bay with offensive spellcasting support, helping any of their regiments that need it. That offensive spellcasting support is a consideration I needed to take into account, because sooner or later you have to extend into the teeth of Dweghom, spellcasting in particular, and it is very dangerous, whether it is steel debuffs that are just devastating to regiments in this list, to offensive fire spellcasting, to magma spellcasting, and spoiler alert, I would play against all three of those this game. There is a spell that every chapter mage has, I believe it's called Elemental Vortex, that is very, very good against those attacks. It just reduces every spell casting against the regiment that you cast it on. Every spell counts as rolling 2 fewer successes, and that tends to just cause spells to completely fail. Even Dweghom spell casting through interference really struggles to push through that, and it more or less lets you make one regiment per round just about invulnerable to spell casting. That has the secondary effect of being very, very good into Water Court Sorcerer Kings, because a lot of their damage right now comes from Marids, which are spellcasting and ranged attack units. And when you can say that regiment there, that is basically invulnerable to your water spellcasting, come and have a go if you think you're hard enough, is very valuable. Now, you don't need to be a water spellcaster to access that. Every chapter mage has access to that spell, along with a little elemental missile. But as noted, I had to take a water mage in case I fought Sorcerer Kings at all, because otherwise the unit would just be dead for free at infinite range, and that spell would be very valuable in the multiple games against Dweghom that I played. So overall, I like this list a lot. It plays a very fair kind of conquest, but it has a lot of mass. It has a lot of mass, it is very durable. It's able to sustain a lot of damage if you can just keep your front toward enemy, and clocking in at 14 activations, it's pretty wide as well. So I like this a lot. Originally, again, I wrote the first version of this list just to see how many painted models of mine I could put into a list, and the end product, something I was very happy to play in an event. Very few changes that I would make in future. Overall, I rate this list very highly. Now, let's talk about how it did over the course of 5 rounds. Oh, and just in case you're interested as to why I was so focused on getting as many painted regiments onto the field as I could, this is a picture of some of the painted models in my army. I am very, very happy with how this has turned out, and apparently the other players at the event thought so too, because the list did in fact win Best Painted, which I am actually genuinely humbled by, because there were some absolute crackers on display at the event, some beautiful lists, including keep your eye out for the Dweghom list we're playing against in round 5, because it is also exceptionally gorgeous. Now, let's jump into round 1, where we will be playing melee against Weavers. My opponent was Reese, and Reese combines in one person both an incredibly beloved community member from Queensland and a member of the Parabellum design team. Reese is very active in the game, and he made the trip down to HeroCon to play Weavers, and this is the list that he played. Now he's running, and I will not pronounce any of these correctly, a Runshi Warlord, so that's Spring Court, and she has the Reinvigoration Mastery. Reinvigoration pulses a healing aura once per game off of any regiment of mine that blooms, healing for 2 and a fairly wide aura. Otherwise, the Runshi is just a ranged character, and she'll be joining those Kern skirmishers. There are then 2 units of Scythian riders. These are the melee and healing moths. They have flight and fluid formation. They are quite fast, particularly in spring turns when the weavers go through their seasons. And as they move over regiments, they can heal either for 3 or 5 depending on the season. They can also do bombing runs on enemy regiments, but mostly they are a relatively cheap, fluid formation, flying fast melee unit with chip healing here and there. Generally, they're taken a little bit less than the ranged Moth Riders. The ranged Moth Riders have kind of a clearer use because they're opportunist range attack moths. But you do want to mix some of the melee Moth Riders into your Weaver lists, because the chip healing does definitely add up, and you just kind of want to generally avoid what we'd call monoculture issues, where your list just doesn't have the tools to do everything that it might want to do. This warband is rounded out with a Scoth Drake that is the melee Drake. It has Opportunist, Flawless Strikes, Cleave, and Terror. The main thing about the Scoth Drake, in addition to being another fast unit with flying, is that it's very, very difficult to kill in anything like a one-on-one attack. Attacking it causes blooms. Those blooms cause it to heal either for 3 or 5, and those blooms can also trigger reinvigoration, which means that in any given turn, if you're fighting it with just one thing, in response to that attack, it will heal between 3 and 7 wounds. And given it has a reasonably deep wound count, good defense, serviceable evasion, etc., it can be just very difficult to pin that thing down in a one-on-one fight. We then have a Morshi. This is the melee Shi character. It's Court of Autumn, and it has the Drake Rider mastery. So that lets it ride the Coil Drake in its warband, and this is a combination that I really like. Now, classically, you might expect sort of the biggest synergy to be, hey, I'll take the Run Shi, that's the ranged Shi character. I'll give it Drake Rider. But one of the things you want that Coil Drake to be able to do is as much damage as possible, and that in particular means being able to fight in a sustained melee if it needs to. And so the melee character on its back, it can still absolutely do the Heavenly Breath, blow out a whole bunch of units in a wide radius, but having the Morshi on its back lets it do that and fight just that bit more effectively in melee than it would if it had the Runshi. And that's really necessary because this list, although it has a ton going on, it doesn't have that much necessary punch in melee, and so those drakes need to do a lot of heavy lifting, and we'll kind of talk about that in a bit. We then got 2 units of 3 Will-O-Wisps. These guys are just the best screen in the game, and they are absolutely dedicated to that role. Very cheap and very annoying. They are part of what makes Weavers really good at doing things like turning flanks, causing enemies to expose themselves. Because that unit is fundamentally expendable, it's a lethal demise evasion regiment. It's shockingly hard to put down at range thanks to loose formation. You kind of have to commit into melee to deal with them usually, and then you'll kill this 100-point regiment, and it will be angled to turn your flank towards something else that will then exploit that vulnerability. Finally, we have a She of Summer. Not even going to try and pronounce that first name. She is the spellcaster. Now, for my money, the Summer Court spellcasting basically sucks, and it would do nothing the entire game. The Winter Court is much more relevant, but secondary to all of that basically is going into this metagame where you have to worry about things like Sorcerer Kings, you have to worry about spellcasting spiders, you have to worry about Dweghom. Just put interference in your lists. Just do it. Just put interference in your lists. She represents interference in this list, and for that reason I would put her in regardless. If she had no spells, I would probably still include her in a Weaver's list because you have to just be able to stall out some of that offensive spellcasting. She's going to be joining a unit of 3 Kern skirmishers, and then we mentioned the melee moths before. Here we have 3 units of Sienna Riders, and these are the ranged moths. They have Opportunist, a bunch of attacks, very good at peppering things down, and adding to that flying, fast, fluid formation style that this list is doing. Now, to talk about the reasoning behind this list, there is a notable absence from the Weavers lineup that exists so far from this list, and that is because this list was built very specifically by Reese to not take any Cran Guardians whatsoever. Now, Cran Guardians, if you're a Weavers player, are very solid. They are not aggressively expensive, they are very durable. The Vanguard on them especially is incredible. They're actually surprisingly fast because they always count as being in season. That's a weird turn of phrase. And so they're a great unit for either taking space or reinforcing aggressively, but they are a defense 3 with shield regiment, and they're only resolve 3. And that means that if your dice fail, they really fail, because if you just badly whiff your defense rolls, you can then have to take all of those resolve rolls, and their resolve can't stand up to that. And so they basically failed Reese at every turn during testing when he was writing this list. His dice are in fact just notorious, like legendarily bad. And so this list is designed just not to give his dice that opportunity. One of the really interesting things, actually, and this was a conversation that happened a couple of times over the weekend, is the interesting comparison between Defense 4 and Evasion 2, because they sit on kind of opposite sides of the spectrum. When you're playing with Defense 4, there are basically always 2 outcomes. It will either do what you expect it to do and survive fairly well, or it will fail you, sometimes catastrophically. Evasion is weirdly the opposite. An Evasion 2 regiment will always do one of either 2 things. It will die, which you expected because it's only Evasion 2, or it won't, because over enough attacks you will inevitably get those occasions where Evasion 2 outperforms, just here and there as a matter of sheer statistical necessity. And so it's basically impossible to be disappointed with the performance of an Evasion 2 regiment, whereas it is always possible to be disappointed with the performance of a Defense 3/4 regiment. And this list is really built around that, where this list is very fast, it's very fluid, and it's very good at forcing you to turn your flanks to engage it. and then capitalizing on those occasions either where just the evasion outperforms and a regiment survives and then gets healed up, etc., either by collapsing in with range damage or going in with the dragons. The dragons kind of represent the largest weakness of this list, not because they are weak, they are incredible, but because they are not purpose built for that role of exploiting a turned flank. The biggest issue this list has, like overwhelmingly, is that it does just a bunch of chip damage, a bunch of non-cleave, and it's just the dragons that are doing that exploit the flanks role. And they're fine, they're dangerous, but they're not catastrophically dangerous. They're not blow you out because you had the temerity to allow a charge clash. Like the Scoth Drake, for example, it's got 12 attacks. The best case scenario for it still doesn't necessarily result in it cleanly one-tapping units that it attacks, especially not large, durable units, spoiler alert, whereas something like, for example, the Gem Red Knights would, for basically the same cost, be much better suited to that absolute collapse, taking full advantage of a turned flank. Being able to do things like collapse this list down a little bit, cut some of the Moth Riders, for example, get a unit in that is much more purpose-built for that devastating flank blowout would let this list perform better. But that's kind of just the nature of Weavers at the moment. They are the game's youngest faction. They've got a relatively complete roster with their early releases, but there are a few things that they're still waiting on. And while to my knowledge, the initial result people have seen from them, particularly in the European and American communities, have been very good, I do think we're still kind of just waiting for them to fully flower as releases roll out over the coming months. Now, this game was only my third against Weavers, and that would definitely be the thing that presented the biggest challenge for me this game. Reese needed to spend a bunch of time explaining to me what all of these rules did. I had a handle on how the seasons, etc. worked, but the list I'd played against previously had been more traditional. They had, for example, included Cran Guardians, and so I was very much feeling my way into the unknown against the huge amount of fluidity that Reese had access to. On my end, however, the matchup just mechanically is well suited to me. The Weaver's list presents just a ton of non-armor piercing ranged attacks and chip damage, and I present a very high frontal defense with rerolls and a fair bit of sustain on the infantry. And that would broadly be the thing that I relied upon to carry me through the game, although it would be a damn close run thing. In the absence of as much knowledge about this matchup as I would like, I basically followed the doctrine I had built for this list, and we can see the run out as it has broadly occurred over the first 2 turns here. We can see that we've got my 2 large infantry regiments with the Archangel in between them. The Chapter Mage is positioned to support both of those regiments as needed, and then the weaker flank is being held by the Feudal Mounted Lord, who, because the Archangel is over here giving Divine Purpose, has a Theist Priest in dedicated support to make sure that there is always Divine Purpose on that unit. Now, how you can vary this run out if you need to is basically just changing where the Knight MSUs go. We can see 2 of the Knight MSUs here and here. They've moved up to hang out near the Feudal Infantry regiments because I gauged that as needing the support. I did consider running them on up this flank, but ultimately they needed to be present to ensure that certain fights were won. Reese's deployment, for his part, would be doing one of the things that his list can actually do quite well, and which is a little bit counterintuitive, which would be heavily declining a flank because he has almost zero risk of logjam. One of the things that you can run into, if you're not very practiced with it, when you deploy like this, we can see everything of his is clustered in this space here, with impassable terrain blocking off one flank and forest constraining the lanes of advance, although he obviously, as Weavers, doesn't care at all about the forests. You can logjam yourself very badly if you try for that kind of thing and you're not very precisely positioned. Or if your entire army has fly, because if your entire army has fly, you don't care at all, and you can unpack with complete flexibility. And that's one of the things that he chose to do. Now, definitely an option that he had, and part of why sort of the Archangel is here and these knights are here, is that right up until both of his dragons were on the table, I had to respect the possibility that multiple dragons could be coming in this direction. If that had happened, I would have needed to have turned this flank into a holding position, but instead he compressed into this space heavily and then unpacked using his movement and fly and fluid formation. This would turn over the course of multiple turns into just an absolute hot mess with casualties everywhere, lots of death, some very well played movements with Reese with this single unit of moths on my right flank would draw quite a lot in. These knights would eventually go and kill it, but it would leave these infantry relatively stranded for some time. while just a ton of fighting happened in the center. Now, a couple of things would basically bail me out of the game here. The first is that, as noted, even with a Drake in the flank of this big regiment, that regiment is very durable and it held on for a really long time. The second thing is that these knights with the Mounted Noble Lord that I spent a ton of time disparaging early in the game just trucked on really well, particularly with the Theist Priest in support. These two units, just by a combination of priority in the initiative order and a bit of luck, were able to collapse this entire flank. The offensive spellcasting from the priest, the durability and damage output of the knights. They didn't decisively win this fight until the very end of the game, but they were able to kill all of the scoring regiments in this space just a little bit earlier than Reese would have liked. And eventually they're able to push out of the forest and put down the ranged units there as well. And that ultimately accounted for almost all of these units here, which meant that even though by the end of the game, Drakes were rampaging out through this space here, that would not happen fast enough, and there would not be enough Weaver scoring units remaining, because a lot of the moths were like prioritized killing the moths. A lot of the moths died, that the score would eventually end 81-55 my way after a brutal and very hard fought game. Very well played by Reese, and it was definitely just the mechanical advantages I had built my list for and which it offered that let me push through this game, because I did not put down either dragon. I spent most of my time killing moths and wisps. Now, round 2 would be against Wadrun, a local player, Will, running a Thunder heavy list. So, this is all Death Cult for Deadly Blades. That's one thing I will have a mechanical advantage against. Deadly Blades is not good at all against my list because of all of those feudal auras, but Thunder Riders absolutely are good against my list. So, we have a Thunder Chieftain Warlord. It's got Resilience, which means that all of the Thunder Riders will always be hardened 1. It's very good in this matchup. He's then got 2 units of Thunder Riders and a Quaddle. We then got a second Thunder Chieftain with 3 Thunder Riders, and then a Mounted Predator. Mounted Predator present here because she joins the Raptor Riders, she increases their punch, but more importantly, she gives both the Quaddle and the Apex Predator in her warband the ability to ignore hindering. That's something that is actually really, really important in this list. Like, yes, Raptor Riders kind of ignore it anyway. Yes, the Quaddle kind of ignores it anyway, except that no, you actually want to get that thing into a forest a lot of the time, so the ability to ignore that hindering is a big deal. But 3 regiments of Thunder Riders is colossally dangerous, but they do not like hindering terrain at all. And so you have to have pieces that can take advantage of hindering terrain. The most common table setup using the standard terrain layouts in Conquest has usually 3 or more pieces of hindering terrain, and wait till you see the fucking table that we played on. And so the Apex is a critical adaptation in the matchup. Now, to talk about the player in addition to the list here, Will is a very, very good local player. He's one of those players that plays every system, tons of 40k, etc., and he's good at all of them. And he has some of the best predictive capacity of anyone I've ever played against, including veteran players of 3, 4, 5 years experience. Will has this ability to look at the table and go, I think I know where your entire army will be in 2 turns. And then he uses that ability to basically see how he thinks you're going to run out, usually with like 95% accuracy, to then field those Raptor Riders and those Quattles and apply pressure and movement in positions that forces you to disrupt and compromise that planned formation. You will see this sometimes with players who have these kind of abilities, where things like Raptor Riders and Quaddles just end up in positions where technically you can respond to, but only by badly compromising your game plan, and it always ends up being very awkward and very difficult and never quite worth it. Will is very good at doing that kind of thing, and then the Thunder Riders arrive. And if you have a disrupted formation and your positions aren't established the way you want, and you stare down 11 stands of Orcs on Triceratops, it's a very challenging game. Now, mechanically, there are things in my favor and things not in my favor in this matchup. Thanks to Divine Purpose, I'm able to not exactly equal his speed and threat range, but I can project threat ranges that enable me to catch up with and grapple, and occasionally even, probably not get the jump on Thunder Riders, but at least force them to respect my ability to countercharge or declare march charges and maybe pin them in place. I'm also a wider list, which means I have more activations, which means that I can occasionally pull some plays at the end of round that potentially I can capitalize on that width and grab or pin something down. Now that's really important because mechanically Thunder Riders built the shit out of me. My entire list is built around projecting a very strong frontal defense Everything in my list basically is either defense 3 with a shield or defense 2 hardened with a shield with rerolls, and Thunder Riders literally go through that. I do not get saves against them if they march charge. I still have to roll defense dice, but I can't pass any of them, and it's really savage. Even in a sustained melee, the fact that they have trample and linebreaker on a decent attack quantity is just very, very strong. Will's list arrives basically in full by turn 3. It's very positioned to achieve like decisive advantages. It projects threat ranges with those Thunder Riders over the top of every single middle scenario zone, and we're playing Breakout, which is a middle scenario zone centric scenario, and so I have to respect that threat hugely. Now, against this, two things would play significantly into my advantage. The first is that I had a practice game against Will exactly with our lists on the Tuesday before the event, and in that game I had the opportunity to get got by all of his bullshit, and while he is very good at predictive capacity and figuring out where things would go and taking advantage of that, one game of practice was enough for me to get an idea of what it was he would do and mimic some of that. So I wasn't taken by surprise by any of his pressure. I rolled my list out calmly. And the second thing that would represent a significant advantage is this fucking table. Now, this table, and I've taken a photo without any of the regiments in the game here, this table is a relatively normal in terms of the terrain pieces that it's using, the terrain pieces that are available, the number and type of terrain pieces. This is fairly normal. It follows all of the rules. It's not breaking any rules. It is a legal terrain setup for Conquest. It is also a stationary example of why water terrain should not be water and hindering. Water should be water. That's the name of the rule. The fact that in the scenario pack, water is told we're supposed to play water as water and hindering means that this table is fucked beyond belief for Will's list. Because this is hindering, 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 and this is hindering. And because this is Bulwark, there are these two objectives here that further constrain movement, which means that even if in a normal scenario you might be able to make sweeping movements through the midfield, you can't here because there's two things in the way. I kind of hate Bulwark as a scenario, by the by. Like, it's not the worst, it's not Foresight, but I'm always frustrated by these things. Now, Will would do a good job of clearing them out, but I was able to exploit the hell out of this terrain. At no point in the entire game would Thunder Riders get an unhindered charge, and if those Thunder Riders don't get an unhindered charge, Will does not have a good game plan. Now, I would like to say I had a plan, and I did. I went into this very focused, I knew what to expect, I was able to pin a number of his regiments back, I was able to catch both Raptor Riders early, I made multiple very solid plays, I'm really happy with how I ran this out, but all of that kind of pales into comparison to the fact that the terrain basically won the game for me. Now, had my plays been a little bit weaker, had I been less prepared, etc., we wouldn't have seen the result that we did, which is that Will was tabled on turn 6. But with a combination of fairly good dice, and in particular fairly average dice on Will's part, that's something that can very definitely happen defensively, by the by. When your army is all defense 3 and you start doing things like taking 16 hits from knights, collapses happen very quickly. But for all that I played this well and had a plan and had some good dice rolls, the table won me this game. That's the long and the short of it. I was able to position very effectively to deny everything Will wanted, and this would be the most one-sided game of the event. Will didn't really deserve that. He's a very, very good player, and yeah, water should be water, not water hindering. Onwards then into round 3, where we would be playing Maelstrom against Ish. He'll tell you that's not short for Ishmael, but there's no reason to believe him. And he's playing Dweghom. Now, Ish and I think, have played at just about every single tournament we both attended. He is a lovely opponent. He's a wonderful guy. I cherish our games, but I do think at some point we need to sit down and play a casual game, because he has only played against me when I'm fully locked in. Now, Ish has been a tempered Creed player basically for as long as he's played Dweg, which is for as long as he's played. He is a dedicated Dweghom player. He's very practiced with them, but this list is indulging a little bit in his giggling enthusiasm for Steelforged and the ability to get as many onto the field as possible and support them as well as possible. So this is a Tempered Sorcerer of Fire, Gifted in Fire Warlord. Gifted in Fire is the mastery or upgrade that gives you the draw event to give you an extra token. And that is relatively necessary in this list because there are multiple outlets. One of them is just boosting your spellcasting, but we'll see Runeforge Plate in a bit. And if you aren't running a Tempered Steel Shaper as your Warlord, you do need to find ways to fuel those kind of elements of industry in the list. The Tempered Sorcerer is going to be in 3 Fireforge, and then there'll be a Hellbringer Drake. Now, to note, Fire. Your kind of choices in Dweghom about what you take as your spellcasters sort of come down to Magma is very good if you can take it in large numbers. You need probably 3 Magma casters to make Magma worthwhile, because the big thing about Magma is that you get down one big eruption, and then you can chain Pyroclasts off of that. But what it means is that you have non-linear returns on that, because the first Magma spellcaster, even if they're your warlord, has to spend one of their spells to get that piece of terrain down before they can throw any pyroclasts out. And so you need multiple additional pyroclasts to make that investment worthwhile. If, therefore, you want to run multiple steel spellcasters because you like doing things like giving Tenacious and Indomitable or Deadly Blades to Steelforged, you need to ease off the Magma, and Fire makes a lot of sense as a result. There are tons of regiments in this list that will awaken regularly, and then the Fire Sorcerer can throw out fire spells from those regiments. And while that makes for a slightly shorter range game plan than the threat that Magma projects, in this instance it's the better choice. We then have a Tempered Steel Shaper with Crown of Ushkalod, and he is in a unit of 4 Magma Forged with a Herald of Magma. Steel Shapers are very good. They are savage in melee because they have Smite. They give terror to the regiment that they join, which is very scary. And their spells can be very high impact. The Crown, in this case, also gives that Magma Forged regiment +1 March and impact attacks, which makes those Magma Forged really zippy. They're going to be base speed of 6, and they can spend tokens to awaken for +2 inches to their charge distance. Now, while that regiment is very good against me in particular, because it's a Cleave 2 Linebreaker regiment that you can then further enhance with the Steel Shaper spells, I'm not 100% convinced by it generally. Magma Forged are a good regiment, and their peak performance especially is excellent, but they have this tendency to collapse if they get jumped. If they aren't able to bring their defenses online, if the spellcasts don't go up to give them things like Tenacious Indomitable, their base defensive stats are not bad, but they're not fantastic either. And for such an investment, holding Tempered Steel Shaper, etc., there's just a little bit of risk you run with them, as much as that can be a very good regiment. We then got 3 Inferno Automata. This is a unit that Ish likes to run. They increase your token generation just a little bit because they are a light regiment, and they're basically relatively fluid and mobile. You could cut them for something else, you could lean all the way into mediums, but having just some presence, particularly a presence in the list, not necessarily that is a light, I think that's less important here, but rather a regiment with fluid formation is just something that Dweghom otherwise don't have at all. And so while I don't think Inferno Automata are necessarily a meta pick, having that just as a tool, just in the list, just in case, to sit between regiments, bounce around, project threat ranges, etc., dive off into a different direction. They don't synergize, for example, despite the fact that they're a Forge regiment, they don't have a command stand, which means you can't arc spells out of them. But I do consider them valuable, although I think you could also pass on them if you wanted to. We then have 2 units of Steelforged, and there'll be more of those coming. Finally, we have a Lost Ancestors Warband. It's going to be a spellcaster of steel, and it's packing Runeforge Plate and Bloody Minded Focus. Now, from memory, Bloody Minded Focus is the one that lets you always die fighting, and Runeforge Plate lets you spend some of your tempered tokens to increase your attack count. Lost Ancestor attacks are very dangerous. While personally I would prefer Runeforge Plate on the Steel Shaper, I'm pretty sure it would compete with the Crown for space, and there is a good argument for getting the extra speed on those Magma Forged. That Lost Ancestor is going to be in a unit of 3 Steel Forged, and then there is a unit of Found. Now, the Found are another one of those, not necessarily meta picks. Much more common in this space would be Lost, but there are a few niche reasons why you might take Found. In this game, Ish would deploy them on a flank. They would kind of just hold that space by themselves, and having a ranged unit to do that, not just that, a ranged unit with long range that is a forged regiment, right? Lost, unlike Found, Lost are not a forged regiment, which means that if they awaken, all well and good, you can't arc spells out of them. And so part of the purpose of the Found is just to push up and pressure. Like, they can do a bunch of different things, right? They can sit behind regiments and arcing fire over them. That's something that you couldn't do with other things other than like a Drake, for example. They can form a layered firing position with the single unit of Fireforged. But if you want to concentrate all of your other forces in a relatively singular place, but still pressure a position, the Found are good for doing that, because 18 inches of range, which they get if they awaken, is enough that it's difficult to like, that's just far enough that responding even with a march charge is difficult. And unlike Lost, they are forged, which means they can awaken and become an arc node, and because they can become an arc node, you can shoot a fireball out of them. And that means they do just a little bit, they do that thing that Dweghom are good at doing, which is projecting force from one part of the battlefield onto the other, thanks to that powerful tempered ability. Now, otherwise, what this list is spelled to do, as kind of mentioned, is it builds layered firing positions. It's backed up by aggressive fire spellcasting and then 3 Steelforged regiments. Steelforged as a unit generally are definitely back on their bullshit. The fact that unit can put out 22 hits plus impacts, cleave 1, hitting on 4s, defense 4, hardened 1, 5 wounds, 4 resolve. Let's give them tenacious and indomitable. Like, Stillforged are gross. They're an overperforming regiment. They are very close to Ashen Dawn while being medium, while being cheaper. And there are, look, far, far worse rationales for a list than I started by putting in 3 Steelforged, and I built the rest of the list from there. Now, in terms of the tail of the tape, this photo was taken at the end of round 3, and we can see a few things developing here that would end up being basically what was significant about this game. I am running out in much the same way as before. This would be the only game of the day where I would run these infantry wide. They were wide very intentionally because I expected them to have to kind of like hold off a large amount while I potentially concentrated with cavalry elsewhere. But as before, we have the 2 infantry regiments with the Archangel in between and lots of units orbiting in support. We would be doing something a little bit weird in this particular case. There are 2 regiments of cavalry here on my right flank, and that was simply because I could not, in Maelstrom, but just generally, I could not afford the risk. When they arrived, I had passable reinforcement rolls this game. I was on the board early enough, and Ish did a fairly clever thing where he kept his Fireforged and some Steelforged off, and there was enough space basically in this position here that he could have pushed up very aggressively, including with the Hellbringer Drake. And the risk that I could not really take was that if Ish built a firing line here and pushed down towards this zone, I had to have enough force to hold that for multiple turns, win the fight ideally if possible, but I had to be able to hold because Maelstrom is a scenario where the scoring is brutal. If you fall behind too quickly on Maelstrom, recovering can be impossible. There is no like catch-up scoring, there's no scoring for holding lots of things. Maelstrom is not a scenario where you necessarily win attritionally. Now, ultimately what that would mean is that Ish with just some Inferno Automata and some Found would bait a significant overcommitment of my forces, but I was able to return the favor because over here we can see a Steel Shaper with Lost Ancestor, and they would sit on that zone the entire game until I would eventually come and kill them. And this is far too inexpensive unit to be sitting around doing nothing. And that is kind of an issue with Ish's list, where he doesn't really have any disposable scoring units. Now, that can be totally fine if you win decisively somewhere, you hold with that space, you use things like your Fireforged or even a Hellbringer, for example, to sit on this zone and project force out. Steelforged are a very bad unit for that. Steelforged are only doing something if they're in combat, and so what would eventually materialize on this flank is a single MSU of men-at-arms sitting here 11 inches from the zone saying, hey, we don't want any trouble, but if you leave that zone, we're taking it. And that presence would pin 350 something points in place for most of the game, which is very significant. Now, how Ish should have responded to that is to bring the Hellbringer Drake on, just sit here and fire all guns at them. Yes, it's through the forest, who cares? Just keep doing that forever to let this unit run free. But he didn't do that. Instead, he brought the Hellbringer on to build the Dweghom box over here. Now, the Hellbringer got some very nice shots into the flank of the Archangel when she pushed up and around in this direction, but it meant that it wasn't in a position to unlock the Steelforge. That would be a big deal. Kind of the other thing that happened generally is the impact of psychology on the game. As I mentioned, Ish is the most wonderful dude and very solid player, but he and I have played 3, maybe 4 times now, only ever under event conditions. Usually in this kind of circumstance where it's like round 3 or round 4. And that means he's only played against me when I'm locked in and sweaty, and those games have not yet resulted in any wins for him. And so he kind of got himself into this headspace where he was of the opinion that if nothing else changed, the status quo would favor me, in the sense that I was probably going to win, kind of in amorphous air quotes. That was not necessarily an accurate appraisal. I'm a very good player, but you have to evaluate the scenario, not and the board state, not just the person who is playing. If you go into a game and you say, well, I'm going to lose if I do nothing before anyone is on the zones, you will start making risky decisions too early. And that's what happened here. There is absolutely time and place for those situations, right? Where you look at the board and you go, some bad stuff has happened, things have begun to go wrong, my position is falling apart, I'm behind on scenario, I don't know if I can recover unless I push my luck. But recognizing when it is the time in the game to start playing your outs is actually a really valuable skill. And often it's quite late in the game. I had a game a month or two ago against a very good Sorcerer Kings player from Nara who traveled up to give us a game. And remember how I mentioned all those casualties that you can sustain from Sorcerer Kings rituals? Yeah, I was down like 500 points just to spam casting Spiteful Winds. Turns out there's a handicap I can't play through, and it's 500 points down against a 2,000 point list. That is a game that that player, Penny, absolutely should have won, and I recognized the point in the game where I had to play my outs, and frankly, I won that game only because I janked an Archangel Charge on a 6, which just barely scraped things back. That was on like turn 7 or 8 or 9. When you have to start making those decisions is usually later in the game, only when you have come to the conclusion, yes, I am behind, I'm genuinely behind, it's time to start trying to play my outs. Not on turn 3. And that kind of is what happened here, where Ish got into his own head just a little bit, and he did things like, for example, this Magma Forged regiment here would end up going for aggressive charges, and there was no need to do that. This is a list, this Dweghom list is very powerful in melee, it has multiple units of Steel Forged, like God knows they're very strong, and I have piss all in the way of range units. I am on zones, yes, he needs to shift me eventually, but I am not actually exerting any meaningful pressure. If you have a sufficiently powerful punch to throw, you can just take a turn to wait and unpack your force and build your formations, and that relies on accurately assessing whether or not you're ahead or behind, and when it is time to pull those triggers. Ish pulled the trigger one turn too early out of kind of a phantom sense of pressure, and while, look, frankly, his list would do its absolute damnedest to pull him back into the game, because it turns out that 3 units of Steel Forged and Fire Forged, and all of the Fire spellcasting and the Steel spellcasting, etc., is really, really good just by the by. Those 2 decision points, the allocation of the Hellbringer and then the ability to put the decision to pull the trigger a turn early, ultimately is what would shift things against Ish and in my favor. I would have to do a lot of work after I won this flank, pushing around, orienting in this direction, but I would eventually be able to sweep across the table, and I would clear Ish's army out, including eventually collapsing in on and destroying the Steel Shaper with Ancestor on about turn 7, and then scored the game out to there, ending on a 35-9 win. Now that would pull us into day 2 as one of only 3 or 4 undefeated players. One of the first major upsets of the day had occurred in the final round of day 1, when Saxon from Australia and Ewan from Australia, both previous contestants at Worlds, had played against one another, and Ewan had taken the win off the back of a game where both players had hard committed into a turn where the person who won supremacy was going to roll up the game. Ewan had the advantage on that roll, but it could really go either way, and that would knock Saxon's Gods and Mortals Fallen Divinity list out of contention for first, but he would comfortably trot in on 4-1 by the end of the event. We will not see him in this battle report, but it is a fantastic Fallen Divinity list that makes excellent use of very early game pressure. It's got multiple units of Assassins. It's got just a ton of cavalry, all medium cavalry. The list is very good at, like, it's 15 activations, and it's almost all on the board early, and so the list is good at just exerting this tremendous early game pressure that outscores you on scenario aggressively because the Assassins have Vanguard, then the Prodromoy turn up. And if you fight your way through all of that, then the list has got a late game plan because it's a Fallen Divinity list. And if she hits tier 3, and both of your armies are in shambles because you've been fighting your way clear of all of these Assassins and Prodromoy and Cataphractoi, there's a very good chance that just her existing as your plan B just wins the game by dint of her mere existence. So he would come 4-1. He'd actually end the event in a very powerful 3rd place position. And while we wouldn't see him in this event, I did want to give that list a shout out because it's very innovative and very cool. Had he won, actually it would have been the 2nd year in a row that a Fallen Divinity list won HeroCon, but in this case he would come in at 3rd against a very tough field and very well deserved. Now that narrowed the list of players that I could play against in round 4 down considerably, and as it happens, we would be playing against Jacob from Nara and his Euroni. Now, we really shouldn't beat around the bush here. There is a significant flaw in this list, and that's that it didn't have $1,000 to spend on 3 more spiders than the one that he owned. However, frankly, I can't blame a man for not making unwise short-term investments. And so instead what we've got is a list that just plays on Euroni's more kind of traditional strengths, in that it activates very flexibly, it has good speed and threat ranges, and everything in the entire list packs a ton of concentrated fat power. So we begin with a Kitsune Bakasu Warlord. She's kind of been the traditional Euroni Warlord in lists that don't run multiple Dweghums. And while we have occasionally seen some interesting play around using the Oyabun Warlord, most of the time it's been a Kitsune Bakasu, and fair enough. Her ability, even with the nerfs to Fluid Formation, her ability to use Fu to hand out Fluid Formation is just a very, very powerful ability, and she personally is a combat monster. There's an interesting little innovation here where she joins a unit of 2 Oni and 1 Kami. Now, historically you'd go, oh, wouldn't you normally go 2 Kami, 1 Oni? But she is running the Ofuda Mastery, which means that if she activates with a Mu card, of which there are many in this list, she can replace that with the effects of Sui. And Sui lets you change the command card in a unit, and so what she gets here is the default power of Oni and the killing power of Oni, but if she ever needs to change gears, she can use Sui to switch the command stand over to Kami and all of a sudden get the Kami's defensive bonuses. You can also nominally use Ofuda as just kind of a flexibility piece, where if you need to have the unit get fluid formation, you can have her activate with a Mu card and still get the benefits of Fu, and that's all kind of useful. Now, the rest of the warband is 2 units of 3 Damaru. Damaru are still very powerful. They used to be completely ubiquitous because you could put things like Kitsune in the Damaru and have a scoring light regiment. That no longer exists, but Damaru are still an absolute blender of a regiment for not terribly expensive. They are absolutely fragile, but they are fast and dangerous and good at moving forward and putting up pressure. They can inflict just an absolute ton of hits. We then have a Jorogumu Mahotsu, that's the spellcasting spider, able to heal, able to hand out defenses, etc. She's got 2 Tengu Bushi and then 2 times 2 Tengu Ayakashi. That's 2 Tengu with the bows, 2 units of 2 Tengu with the bows, and 1 unit of Tengu with the swords. Finally, we have a Fu Daimyo. Fu means that he can activate using the Fu card to grant fluid formation to his unit. He's just going to be in a pair of Oni, but that is an absolute slapper of a unit because the Daimyo himself does tons of damage, and the Hachiwa Mastery means that that unit ignores hindering. Oni activating off of Ka actually are very potent on the impacts. They have Juggernaut natively, Juggernaut plus fluid formation, plus tons of impacts and unhindered. Just is a really solid unit. And then 2 more units of 2 Oni. Oni are hugely dangerous. Loads of attacks with good clash, very high cleave, and impact and juggernaut. They are fantastic trading pieces where not only are they kind of durable, because they've got 7 wounds apiece, but they just absolutely crank in melee. Now, if we're going to talk about some things about this list that could change, there are some things that I probably would change. Probably the biggest one would be trading down at least one of those Tengu Ayakashi units to a unit of Tengu Bushi. This is just a matter of personal experience. I do like having 1 unit of Bowbirds. They make a good early game activation. They're good at exerting just a little bit of pressure. They're good at clearing off objective markers. But Tengu Bushi are one of the most efficient regiments in the game. They are hugely threatening. They make a lot more use of all of the flying abilities that Tengu have, and their flawless strikes on 1s and 2s just goes through certain things like a hot knife through butter. They are also cheaper, and the 10 points that you saved could be used to do things like, for example, turn a unit of Damaru into another unit of Tengu Bushi. There's also a bunch of other little changes that you can make with this list. There are small tinkers here or there. Obviously, the most powerful thing to do would be to scrap it and slap in 3 more spiders, but assuming that we play it broadly as it is, because we're looking to build a Euroni collection that lasts the test of time, that's basically the only tweak that I would make. Just run a few less bows, a few more sword birds, because sword birds are very, very good. Bow birds are serviceable, but they don't have quite the same threat and power and effect because all of the mobility of the birds just works better on the melee elements. Now, the scenario draw here would be very important because the scenario is head to head. And head to head is not a scenario I was surprised to see, but it was, and there's no other way to put this, it was lucky, it was straight up lucky for me to have head to head draw in this matchup against Euroni. Because my list can concentrate force better than Euroni can, but it cannot concentrate force better than, for example, Dweghom or a Fallen Divinity list can. And that was a really big deal. Scenarios are not repeated in Conquest tournaments, and so getting head-to-head out of the way here was favourable for me, rather than being, for example, massively unfavourable in what would be the next matchup. Now, when I say concentrate force, what I basically mean is get as much force as you can in a small space, because when you have two forces meet, the one that is more concentrated tends to be able to defeat its opponent in detail. You do more damage in one space than your opponent does. You overcome the forces they have in that position more quickly, you secure victory there, and then have resources to dedicate elsewhere. That is a useful ability in basically every scenario, but it is very important in head-to-head. Now, head-to-head, because it has kill points, really actually is just annihilation with extra steps, but you do have to draw, you will inevitably find yourself drawn towards this central zone, because it is easy to get onto, it draws both players towards it, and it does, admittedly, score a lot of points. Head-to-head, generally, the presence of kill points usually means that the game will be decided not by aggressive flanking maneuvers and taking the small zones or anything like that. The game in head-to-head will usually be decided by a big fight here, because whoever wins it will both secure this zone, which is worth 3 points every round, and have killed a bunch of stuff in this space, which will comfortably overcome any advantage that might have been secured by grabbing the 4-point zone. So head-to-head really is a fight on a single space. Some armies do that much better than others. Mine does it fine. It does it better than Yuguri, but worse, for example, than Dweghom. So that immediately was a good point of luck. The second nominal point of luck here was that this was an asymmetric table. We weighed the roll off to see, like, pick table sides, right? The terrain layout is symmetrical, but the scenario makes it asymmetric. And Jacob picked the side that he is playing from. Now, that's a perfectly reasonable choice. If you look at how things are laid out, my approach up through this space is it's got no cover from forests, and it has this big ass piece of water. That is awkward in terms of terrain. It is not defensible. It leaves me exposed. But that would ultimately have less of an effect on the game than the fact that I have an impassable terrain piece here, and Jacob has an impassable terrain piece here. And that impassable terrain piece that he is dealing with constrains his advance toward the central objective zone just enough that he got a tiny little bit jammed up. And that caused him massive problems because he already had less force concentration than I did. We can see, right, deep formations that I've got here. These are big units of men-at-arms with crossbows behind, knights on the flank, archangel in the center. This is just a ton of violence in one spot because I have this concentrated force, and I'm using knights to kind of like, basically to hold off the flanks and secure my position as I move forward here. As this photo was being taken, yes, this unit of knights have made a very aggressive march charge. Oh, by the way, this is not a legal formation. It's just the best I could do with the lancers. This knight is actually a bit further in this direction just before anyone makes a comment. This is a very aggressive march charge into these Tengu. That is something that over the course of the remainder of the game, these militia would move up. A holy fire would go into these Damaru. It would do a bunch of damage. This position, while not secure because there are, Oni coming for my ass, I would hold off the fights here while all of my big regiments moved in these directions. And what happened basically was that Jacob got just a tiny little bit log jammed. There was a charge that he attempted with Damaru. He could have done a march charge. He could have walked backwards. There are a number of things he could have done. He attempted a 5+ charge into knights. Now, I would have been perfectly happy if he'd passed that. He was hindered. Now, it's a light regiment. It still gets inspired. But all of the damage that Damaru Damashi do come from their high attack volume. And when they are making no impact attacks, there is going to be a limit to how many hits they score, and knights have defense 4 frontally with rerolling 6s. It's very possible to take no damage from that, and then I would just activate the knights and clap him back. What happened instead was that he failed, moved forward 1 inch, then I ran the knights forward, not to charge, but just to sit here, 1 inch away from the Damaru Damashi. That logged jammed these Oni. They could not get through, basically as other things were run out that turn. And Jacob got very stuck in place. Now, the correct thing to do was just to take a turn, breathe it out, reallocate your force, just get shit in a position, not make this aggressive charge with the Damaru, but he was no longer in that option. Once the Damaru had failed the charge, once the knights had moved forward, like, that was it. He was now kind of stuck, and the only path he had out of that was to get very aggressive. So what he did with the Mahotsu was throw up her defensive buff and basically just run forward, being like, this is how I will clear this space. You have to fight the Mahotsu now. I will get in behind her. And I did. I fought the Mahotsu, and it took multiple turns because spiders are ridiculously tough. And he was kind of able to unclear himself. but it wasn't enough. He had to overextend. I got attacks of my choosing. I did like 13 damage to the Mahotsu before it was able to activate. It was inside interference, so it couldn't get its spells up the next turn. It didn't heal itself. And while he would absolutely clear through the Archangel and put her down, he would also wear like 22 hits cleave 3 into this Kami Oni unit off of the Elysian Fragment Slam. And basically exactly the thing that happens in head-to-head happened, where there was a big scrap in this space, and I won it. And because I won it, not only was I securing this 3-point zone, but I had a bunch of kill points. Now, it would get worse for Jacob before it got better, because I was able to pull just a few good plays on this left flank as well. Because of the position that I was in over here, because Jacob was log jammed, I was actually able to deprioritize this zone in the initiative, which meant that this unit of knights, which was staring down both Oni and birds, was able to just get given initiative priority often enough to clear through both of them, which meant that I also collapsed the left flank, and that ultimately meant that the game was a blowout. There were a lot of VPs scored here. This would end up being a 68-point win for me, and it would push me on into the finals. And this is the list that I would be playing against. This list would be a magma-centric, forged Dweghom list, piloted by my very good friend Ewan. And while Conquest is absolutely one of those any given Sunday games where you can never guarantee yourself a tournament win, and while there are some very good players in this country, for my money, Ewan is probably the strongest player in the country. It's close, but I'm pretty sure that he is. And this list is a murder. Now, Ewan has played a bunch of different factions. I think he has some Nords. I know he's played some Wardrun. Much of his experience is with Sorcerer Kings, and he has, kind of unsurprisingly, recently pivoted from burning people to death with Sorcerer Kings to burning people to death with Dweghom. Ewan's always been very, very good at kind of just looking at the board and seeing how all of the space exists. It's not quite the same as the predictive capacity that Will, my round 2 opponent, has, for example, although Ewan has played enough and is experienced enough to kind of have the same thing anyway. But Ewan can look at space and can just kind of see the threat that units project very organically. And so what he tends to favor and be very good against is just seeing how far he can push that threat range and how much he can do either with very, very fast regiments, or with very long range regiments, or with a combination of the two. And while Dweghom have historically been considered not necessarily the fastest army, they project a tremendous amount of orbital death laser power with this list. Let's just talk through what's in it first, because we begin with a Magma Tempered Sorcerer with the Crown of Uskalod. That's the one that gives +1 speed and some impact attacks. And that Tempered Sorcerer is in a unit of Hold Warriors. This is a very specific piece of tech. There is also Lost in this list. Those Lost are always Awakened, so they give out a speed buff. And Hold Warriors, these ones are speed 6 with a banner and Vanguard, and they can pick up some additional march even on the turn they arrive by moving into the Lost Aura and then carrying on through, which means that potentially as early as turn 2, this list can bring down an orbital laser strike by having those Hold Warriors yeet up the board, then have the Warlord throw out a Magmatic Seep to create erupting terrain, and then throw out potentially 3 Pyroclasts all boosted with extra dice from the Tempered Mastery spending tokens to just get picks on units as far up as like 37 inches from Ewan's deployment zone as early as turn 2. Now, I know from him recounting the games to me that Ewan had multiple games where he sat down and he explained to his opponent exactly what he was capable of. Then he did it anyway, because it turns out it's very hard to not move forward in this game. And even after the turn 2 threat of all of this pyroclastic laser going into something and annihilating it as early as turn 2, you still have the same threat existing from every single regiment. Awakening, marching, and picking one thing to delete off of the table. Now, to make that work, you need multiple magma casters. You can't get away with just one, so there are 3 magma casters and 1 steel caster in this list. Early version of the list I know went all in on magma and had 4. I believe through testing basically what Ewan found is that 3 magma casters was enough. And there is a very specific matchup. Well, steel is very good generally, but there is a very specific matchup where steel is very, very good. And that's if you're hate listing a Fallen Divinity. Now, frankly, steel absolutely ruins my day as well. It's just very versatile and very well rounded, but it does also just give you a trump card. I actually don't think it mattered in the game that Ewan played against Saxon. Things came to a head far too aggressively for that. It wasn't actually significant as far as I'm aware. Many, many more things played in. But if, for example, you are playing into a Fallen Divinity, she's not a common pick, but if you are dealing with a Fallen Divinity and you're playing Dweghom, Steel basically takes the tier 3 divinity and makes her shockingly vulnerable to anything in your list. Very powerful. Don't believe that came up, but I can absolutely see how, no, 3 Magma is enough to get a pick on any MSU in the game. Therefore, let's round the list out, give ourselves the ability to give Deadly Blades, to give Tenacious and Indomitable. Steel is a very powerful school, and even being able to debuff things like my Knights or optimistically my Men at Arms, very worthwhile. So, rest of the list, we have a second Tempered Sorcerer, Magma in 3 Fireforged. That's going to make this ultimately a unit of 4. 3 Magma Forged. These Magma Forged are kind of just a flex piece. You can't afford 3 more Steel Forged, so you take Magma Forged instead, but Magma Forged are eminently sound. This isn't a really significant investment, they're just good and dangerous. We then have the Steel Lost Ancestor. He's going to be in 3 Steel Forge. Then we have a unit of 4 Fireforge. Now, early versions of this list paid for things like Thaumaturgy. I don't think I've ever seen Thaumaturgy actually get triggered. It had a few little upgrades here and there. Those got cut for an extra stand of Fireforged. And I hate that because Fireforged are really, really good. Fireforged are hugely durable, they have tons of wounds, they have very high defense. Their defense means that the resolve, like, yes, you can have collapses in the same way that Crane Guardians can collapse, but this is a unit that's going to blow you the hell up with guns before you close. And once you get into melee, it's often durable enough just to win the subsequent fight. Like, these guys are men-at-arms in combat, but way tougher and more wounds and with spell support. Often all you need these Fireforged to be is a holding unit that like throws out one really powerful volley, then gets march charged, and then spells just annihilate everything that's in contact with it, and then you repeat. For that to work, all you need for it to do is hold, and since Dweghom regiments, they technically can be broken, but they can't be shattered. These Fireforged are good to the last drop. There's absolutely no risk of them being a 4-strong regiment, and that's 20 wounds defense 4. It's just going to go and go and go. The extra Fireforged stand here is really nice. We then have 3 Steelforged, which the Steel Lost Ancestor is in. Then a Lost Ancestor Magma with Litanies of Victory. Litanies of Victory is always awakened. That's necessary in conjunction with the Lost. Those Lost give out an aura of +1 March, provided they are awakened. You just want that always on. Plays open up if they are always awakened. You don't have to awaken them then. It means you can do certain things, you can change the way that you run out your turn, it's just much more convenient. This is not a luxury upgrade, it's very worthwhile. And then 3 more Steel Forged. That makes this in total 8 regiments but 12 activations. 12 is wide by Dweghom standards. It's difficult to go too many more unless you go full Goon Swarm and just have tons and tons and tons of cheaper melee regiments. If you want powerful, elite, layered firepower, Steel Forge, etc., this is about as wide as you can get, and this is a very, very strong list. It's trading on all of the most powerful things in Dweghom. Ewan runs it with intense discipline. It fights incredibly well, and it is shockingly difficult, close to impossible, to overcome in a battle of attrition. Against that, a few things would play into my favor. Oh, by the way, the army is also fucking gorgeous. Just take a moment and look at that. This is all Vivid Fire OSL. He's done like barrels, like the Fireforged are all in shooting animation kind of pose, where the guns are all blazing. The army is just phenomenally incredible to look at. Like, it's genuinely gorgeous. Just luxuriate for a moment in this battle and this run out. Now, a couple of things would play to my favor in this scenario. The first is that it was declined flank, which is like fine. It's a scenario. I'll take it. It's totally okay. The important thing is it's not head to head, which we got out of the way last turn. The second thing that was important is that even though my supremacy rolls would mostly be crap, I would have slightly better than average reinforcement rolls. In fact, actually better than average reinforcement rolls. This would be the only game of the entire event where I would get 3 successful medium rolls out of 5 on round 2. That got all of my characters onto the board, which gave me a very comfortable, like, my entire army deployed only after I saw most of you and stuff. By the way, one of the things I tend to do with this list is that I will hold back my lights. I do not want them onto the board. Because my lights are important in supporting different parts of my army, if I pre-commit either the Theist Priest or the Wizard early, that just commits where my stuff has to go. Because if my Wizard does one part of the table, well, then my infantry have to be there as well. And so, generally speaking, and this was a product of some practice games, my turn 1 rollout is the wizard is held back, and if the priest doesn't arrive, I'm totally fine with that. They will always be present in time for the game to kick off. This is not an Imperial list, it does not Vanguard on quickly enough, it is just not worth trying for early plays. This is Theist Feudal, you build your formations and then you push from there. So, this was not head-to-head, that's one thing that played into my advantage. The reinforcement rolls were the second thing that played into my advantage. The third thing that played into my advantage was that I was aware of the horrors that Ewan's list could wreak, and I was able to avoid it for some of the game. Importantly, I'm pretty sure that I was the only opponent he played against apart from Saxon, where there weren't picks early in the game. I was able to just keep a safe distance. I was able to use the Vortex, Elemental Vortex, the Spell Defense Shield to further create some safety. That plus interference kept me from taking any pyroclastic magma damage until at least the middle of the game. The deployment thing was probably the largest, though. Ewan had to deploy certain things early, and although he's actually very comfortable deploying along a broad front, because all of the spellcasters just focus their firepower wherever they need with near global range, we can see all of the Fireforged and the Warriors are occupying this position here. We have the Warriors in the Warlord, we have the 4 strong Fireforged, and then the 3 strong Fireforged with the Wizard. And my entire deployment is predicated on not wanting any of that smoke. We have stayed away from those for multiple turns. We are shoving up my right flank in hopes of engineering a decisive conflict here, or at least I am able to get onto zones before Ewan is. That is one thing my list can do. Ewan does have one regiment that can get onto zones quickly on turn 2, and he didn't bring them on turn 2 because his reinforcement roll was mediocre. And so I secured a small but significant early scoring lead. And that is a lead that I would absolutely need because in a fair, straight up fight, this is shockingly difficult for me to win. Now, where luck would play against me is that as much as my reinforcement rolls were good, and they were very good, they're like that must be acknowledged, I would not win a supremacy roll the entire game, or near enough to. There was never a supremacy roll that I would win that would matter, and that included a very important role in the middle of the game, because Ewan got very smart with me. Now, this is something that I think with experience I might have been able to better predict. I had my early game generally well configured to not take too much risk from his units. On turn 4, I had this wizard very slightly too late in my stack. And what I mean by that is that I hadn't quite configured my stack correctly thinking about the timing of Ewan's Orbital Death Laser. Because it's not a pure late game play. It takes multiple activations to set up and execute. You need the unit that's going to be the arc node to move forward. Then there are 3 spellcasters that all have to pop off, which means that it is kind of minimum a 4 activation play, which means that it starts happening 8 activations deep into a turn. And my wizard was something like my 10th out of 14 activations, which meant that on turn 4, Ewan was able to move this Lost Regiment up and around, get a Pyroclast down, and then burrow out my wizard and kill her before she got to activate. The crossbows activated that round. They could probably have pulled back and maybe should have, but I wanted them far enough forward to let her give out the interference aura, because, spoiler alert, interference is really, really important against Pyroclast related death. Now, if I had timed her in the stack correctly, right, I needed to have her 7th or 8th, 8 activations deep rather than 9 or 10. When the Lost Regiment ran forward and Ewan measured 18 inches to her, she could have just thrown up Entropic Ward on her regiment. If she'd done that, sure, I would have copped a bunch of Pyroclasts into this unit. That is not the end of the world. This unit can survive those Pyroclasts comfortably. Like, not comfortably, it sucks and I take damage, but this unit has 8 stands of men-at-arms in it. They're hardened, they reroll 6s, they're under interference. Even with interference, crossbows are made of absolute glass and they die, and so she died. Now, the sole upside of her death is that equalized the card count, which meant that we had a turn coming up after that where everyone was ready to go. Triggers were ready to be pulled. Steelforge with Steelshaper were in position, Lost were in position. I'd actually tried to charge them. I had a 4+ charge clash with these knights and they'd failed. That sucked. Would have been really nice to get. Didn't. Ewan's Fireforged were closing in, but would not be prepared yet. This was the time for the breakthrough. This was an even supremacy roll, hadn't won one yet this game, or basically hadn't. I think there'd been one that didn't matter. It was a 50-50 and I lost it. This is not the end of the game, but it took a game in which I had the possibility of a blowout and turned it into the long attritional scrap that it would become. Had I won the roll, my first two cards were Noble Lord into Men-at-Arms. Now, that could have been either Noble Lord, I had 3 units of Men-at-Arms, there was a bunch of flexibility there, I was not locked into doing any of those things. But this would be my Spirit Shine's turn, and I was 8 inches from these Steel Forged, or maybe 9. Either way, 2+ rerollable charge. If I go first, their defenses are not online. Elysian Fragment, Charge, Clash, boom, completely dead. That blows out Ewan's stack. Like, yes, he's got a flank charge with these Steel Forged. It's a hindered flank charge. It sets them up for a collapse. Ewan's Lost Ancestor that's over here has to activate. You have this whole catastrophic failure stack that could have occurred, but it didn't. And that's something that will definitely happen. Now, frankly, even if things go ideal for me this turn, I'm still fighting Steelforged. Magma Forged are over here. There is still a Hellbringer Drake aiming and firing. All of this stuff, all of these Fireforged, this Fireforged gun line is borderline capable of fighting half of my army by itself with spell support, because Fireforged are kind of just better than me in melee and are shockingly dangerous. And the noose is closing on me with these regiments. For me to secure an attritional advantage, right, to actually have more material, I needed the blowout here, and without it, I'm not scuppered, but this becomes a scenario game. Now, one thing that does play into my favor is that Ewan goes for the high roll play. His first two activations are Lost Ancestor into Steelforged, and the Lost Ancestor attempts the spell on these men-at-arms to remove Hardened and give -1 defense. If this succeeds, you borderline just lose this regiment, because you go from saving on 3s to saving on 1s. But it is shockingly hard to succeed that spell against that regiment, because it is a scaling spell with an attunement value equal to the regiment's defense, and men-at-arms are defense 2. They're defense 2 with a shield, but they are base defense 2, which means that that spell needs to succeed on 2, and it needs to roll 4 successes. And even throwing 6 tokens into that, it is very hard to succeed, and in this instance, it didn't go off. On top of that, Ewan's offensive dice were incredibly mid. I actually didn't need to bless the defense against this. I would end up taking like 11 wounds or something, but 11 wounds only kills 2 stands. By the way, shockingly mid 11 wounds. Yes, I know. Not many things can do 11 wounds to a defense 3 hardened indomitable 2 reroll 6s regiment, but Steelforged can. But it meant that when my activation came, I was stuck in a reactive posture, but I had my bless, I'm inspired, we pop Elysian Fragment, and we delete this unit cleanly. That's the only clean thing that happens this turn, because the entire rest of this turn is an absolute hot mess. But a kill is a kill, and basically just scenes of incredible violence ensue. I have to spend the remainder of my game trying to stall out these Fireforged. Much of the fight that happens here, we do eventually push through the Lost. The Archangel and the Knights eventually account for them. We will put those down, and those are 2 big centers of mass, but I just don't at this point have anything that can push into the Death Gauntlet of the Fireforged. This unit of Knights will actually end up pulling back and running around this direction. They will flank, charge, clash the Fireforged, and do nothing, because that's what happens when my Knights fight Fireforged. They will tie them up only for... They actually will survive well enough to tie those Fireforged up for something like, I think, 2 full rounds. But eventually the gauntlet will close, and the Fireforged will push in this direction, only after a tremendous amount of fighting, and are able to clear out everything that Ewan has in this space, and only with the loss of multiple scoring regiments. This puts us in an incredibly tenuous state in the late game. The Archangel has spent most of her time touching this forest, getting +1 evasion whenever possible from the Theist Priest, so that she is evasion 3 and interfered with even against Pyroclast attacks. And she has basically weathered and weathered and weathered all of the storm from all of these Dweghom units before eventually going down. All of the Knights are dead, the Knights are dead, the men-at-arms down here are dead, casualties are everywhere, and the field is strewn with corpses. But I had an early scenario lead, and I am just barely able to pursue it. These men-at-arms have pushed forward and killed the Hellbringer. It retreated, as it actually walked backwards to draw me back off the zone. Didn't matter, still have to get the kill. Eventually we reach a state where I have a mess of regiments occupying this space here, pointing all in the wrong directions because they spent 4 turns trying to kill a single Steelforged stand, etc. But I am able to pivot back around and just hold for long enough. And we reach a point where it is the final round, and each of us basically has to make a decision, because the score is 26-24 my way. At this stage, we nominally both have plays we could make that would secure the draw, or plays we could make that would secure the win, but which would throw the game if they failed. This is the first turn on which I win Supremacy, and well, actually, no, I did win one before, it just didn't matter. And it doesn't matter here either, because my first activation is a Theist Priest, who is going to give +1 cleave to the command-handed character of the remainder of my large men-at-arms regiment. Ewan's first activation is to run his Fireforge as far as possible onto this zone, and importantly, he will turn the flank to my men-at-arms, but he will do so in a way where it's impossible for men-at-arms to... If they men-at-arms charge that regiment, it is not possible for them to get onto this zone, because the command stand, there's just some weird formations with the Fireforged. It's ended up in a position where the command stand is the furthest left regiment because of casualties and how the knights went into them, and so I cannot ever push onto this zone. However, if I kill those Fireforged, maximum number of zones Ewan can score this turn is 2. He does have a unit of warriors that is 6 wide straddling these 2 zones, but I turn off one of them. The maximum number of zones Ewan can score is 2. The maximum number that I can score is 1. Because this zone back here is turned off, I take the charge and I kill the Fireforged. The other unit of men-at-arms then move onto this zone because they can't be interfered with. There's no way to get spellcasting around to them without Ewan leaving a zone, which would not change the score. And even if the Fireforged had survived the men-at-arms, I would have been most likely in a position to get the Theist Priest Regiment onto the zone and interfere. And so that puts us in a situation where at the final round, going into the final round, 26 to me, 24 to Ewan. At the end of this round, I score 2 and Ewan scores 4, leaving the game a 28-28 draw, meaning the event would be decided by strength of schedule. Now, it has been said by me, I have said it, that strength of schedule is the worst system except for all of the other ones that we have tried, and in this particular case, there would be 0.04 of a difference between the two of us. We had each played through an absolute murderer's row of very good opponents, and for all practical purposes, the event was a tie. As it would happen, by 0.04 of strength of schedule, I would end up coming first, but yeah, this event was effectively a tie between 100 Kingdoms and Dweg sharing podium, and in an excellent performance with his Fallen Divinity, Saxon would come third. Overall, a fantastic 2 days. I am recording this on the Sunday of the second day, and my mind is leaving my body because I'm absolutely exhausted, but I wanted to get this recorded and get this out because there are people I thought would find it interesting. It was a cracking 2-day event. I think across the entire con, something like $15,000 was raised for Soldier On, which is outstanding, and the record of the ADF Wargaming Association to date is something like $150,000 over the life of the event, raised for charity. So, top notch to the event, very well organized, even with an absolute crash out by the Parabellum Army app, which was eventually rectified beginning of day 2. We managed to get through with Best Coast pairings for the first day, get everything into the app, everything run on the app in the second day, registered as normal for world points. So 10 out of 10 organization, fantastic venue, and absolutely fantastic crowd. One of the toughest events I've ever played in any system in all of my time playing wargames, and a fantastic 2 days. That wraps this up. I hope very much that you've enjoyed it. Conquest content is a little bit rare on this channel, but this event was too good not to share. If you're looking for more content about Conquest and Conquest in Australia in particular, Ewan and Saxon have been making noises about starting a podcast, and they really should do that if either of you have been listening to this and have gotten this far into the video. And while I floated a number of names, Complement Conquest, Congruent Conquest, and Confident Conquest have all been shut down for some reason, so I don't know what they'll call it other than to keep an eye out for it because it'll be great when they do it. They're both fantastic lads, they've both got a ton of stage presence, and I look forward to listening to anything they produce. I will link it on the channel if and when they start recording. Otherwise, and as always, I hope very much that you've enjoyed this. Big shout out to everyone who attended and everyone who I played against over the course of these 2 days. It was fantastic to see all of you, and I will see you next time for more Conquest content.